The circumstances that lead to clashes between nations are many and varied, but certain underlying conditions almost always influence the onset of war. Among these are a heightened sense of nationalism, a strong military, vital economic interests, and a swell of public opinion in favor of the conflict. In the late 1890s, all of these conditions were present in the conflict surrounding a small island 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
The United States had wanted Cuba for nearly 100 years. Thomas Jefferson had talked about how sooner or later the United States was going to take Cuba. The Cubans rebelled against their Spanish colonial masters, and the first one ended in the 1870s with the United States staying away from it. But in the 1890s, it was different. And it was different because by that time, the United States had about $50 million worth of investments in Cuba. And it was also different because by 1898, the United States now had a new fleet. This is the fleet that is essentially the beginning of the modern American Navy.
You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war.
Public opinion, galvanized by the hyperbolic headlines that came to be known as yellow journalism, increasingly swung toward the Cuban nationalists, even as Roosevelt and others beat the war drum in Washington.
There were groups in the United States who really did have a humanitarian interest in the suffering Cuban people. And there were atrocities that had been committed by the Spanish Army against Cuban nationalists. There were others who wanted the business of Cuba. There were still others who saw Cuba as a strategically important location in the Caribbean. There were folks like Theodore Roosevelt who had been looking for a war for years. This was the best one on offer, and so they were going to snatch it up.
Nationalism is important, militarism is important, economics is important, but they lie there like background. But then what activates this and brings it to life and leads to war is a leader who actually uses them at the right moment to take his people into the war.
McKinley has no more backbone than a chocolate eclair.
When the crisis comes with Cuba in 1898, there are a lot of people in Congress who very, very much want to go to war immediately. McKinley does not want to because he knows that we're not militarily ready yet.
McKinley wasn't a war hawk. McKinley had fought in the Civil War, as Theodore Roosevelt had not. And McKinley remembered what war involved, and so he wasn't quite so quick to go to war. Furthermore, there were important elements of the Republican coalition that were skeptical about a war. The country was pulling out of the Depression of the 1890s, and the idea of a war in Cuba unsettled those people who were making investment decisions.
And McKinley is brilliant in delaying and keeping the war faction in Congress on the defensive and going into Congress on his own terms and on his own timetable, which he does, I mean, right down to the end in April and May of 1898. It seems to me that McKinley is the first modern American president. He controlled Congress in a way that nobody had controlled Congress, probably not even Abraham Lincoln had controlled Congress as McKinley did.
In February 1898, President McKinley sent an American battleship, the Maine, to the harbor of Havana, ostensibly to secure American interests, to safeguard American nationals who lived in Cuba, but also to impress the Spanish government with the seriousness with which the United States government took developments in Cuba. The ship hadn't been there long when it mysteriously blew up.
Maine blown up in Havana Harbor at 9:40 tonight and destroyed. Many wounded and doubtless more killed or drowned.
The McKinley administration was quick to label this an act of sabotage. Now, in our modern parlance, we would call it an act of terrorism. It enraged public opinion in the United States. Until that time, the events in Cuba had been something between the Spanish and the Cubans. Now, the United States was directly involved. It wasn't impossible for McKinley to avoid going to war after this, but it became increasingly difficult.
In April of 1898, President McKinley makes the decision that he has to go to war. And the reason why he has to go to war is because people are telling him that the Cuban revolutionaries are about to win this war on their own. And if they win this war, Cubans are going to control this island and not U.S. officials.
Songs were written, bands played, flags waved, and recruitment centers were overrun as public sentiment went over completely for the war, fueled by cries of, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain."
When those brave black knights who are so bold.
Here, the United States had gone to war against Spain, and yet many of the soldiers that fought in the Spanish-American War were from New Mexico. As a matter of fact, most of the soldiers that charged up San Juan Hill with Teddy Roosevelt were Spanish-Americans. And I think that must have been a little bit strange for them. They were going to fight against the country where their ancestors came from. So that may have been when they first really started to identify as Americans.
The military campaign would be short and relatively painless, with few American casualties. Within weeks of the troops leaving Florida, Cuba was taken, the Spanish fleet was sunk, and the American flag was raised over Santiago Harbor.
A splendid little war, carried on with magnificent intelligence and spirit, favored by that fortune which loves the brave.
John Hay famously called this a splendid little war. I think if you ask McKinley, he would have said it was also a necessary war, that it was necessary to, in fact, control an area that was only 90 miles off the U.S. shores, and that was very, very important for American strategic interest in the Caribbean. And it finally got Spain out of the Western Hemisphere, which is something the Americans have been wanting to do for 150 years.